listening back to this show from Teachers Talk Radio. You can catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Teachers Talk Radio. This is the Twilight Show, and I've been really looking forward to this one, guys, because I've been reading a very interesting book all about the Early Career Teacher Framework, the ECT framework, and I'm very happy to welcome the two authors of this book. I've got Tanya Ovenden-Hope and Holly Kirkpatrick. Good evening.
Hi, Tony.
Good evening, Tony. Nice
How's
to
it
see
going?
you.
Welcome to Teachers Talk Radio. Thank you very much for coming on. And as I said, I've been reading this over the last week or so, which looks like it's slightly out of focus. There we go. And I've really enjoyed it. And this book has really resonated with myself. So we're here today, sponsored by Hachette Learning. And Hachette are our sponsors of our shows. And if you'd like a copy of this book that Tanya and Holly have written, then you can find that book on the Hachette Learning website, guys. So get yourself over to that website and have a look for this book. If you are any way involved in the ECT framework, on any level, it's a very interesting book. So as I said, I've been really looking forward to ask you two some questions on this. So first of all, I know that starting with you, Tanya, that you did write a book on the early career framework previously. So obviously it's quite a passion that you have. And I was interested to know what was your rationale for this latest one?
Well, it's possibly easier to go back to the first one to explain why Holly and I did the second one. So I've been in education a long time. So this is my 36th year in education, starting as a teacher. And through that journey, I've actually explored why teaching can be effective, what things make it harder for teachers to engage with effective professional development and learning. And the research that I undertake in my role as Professor of Education gives me some privileges to receive funding to explore different areas and try and make a difference to the lives of teachers in their everyday practice in schools. So before I wrote the Early Career Framework book, which was called the Early Career Framework, Origins, Opportunities and Outcomes, and that was published by John Catt as well. And John Catt has now become part of Hachette. I had an Education Endowment Foundation grant where I proposed and developed a new program for, we call them early career teachers now, but then they were newly qualified teachers who were thinking about leaving the profession. Because back in 2013, we were talking about, what are we going to do about all of these teachers who are leaving teaching? We've got a real teacher attrition problem and we need to retain them. So I called the program Retain, and the program lasted 1 year and was piloted with primary school teachers in Cornwall, funded by the Education Endowment Foundation, and actually was the very, very forerunner of the Early Career Framework. So the Department for Education looked at the findings of this and used it as the basis for developing the Early Career Framework, which became mandatory in 2019. Because I'd been so involved in teacher development and knew some of the lead providers who'd won the contracts to deliver the Early Career Framework, which is a mandatory provision for beginning teachers early career teachers in all of our schools in England, and it's changed slightly, and we'll talk about that in a minute because that's part of the different early career teacher entitlement that we wrote about in the new book. The Early Career Framework book was to give a little bit of historical perspective about where the Early Career Framework came from, what the lead providers were asked to do, and how they implemented it, particularly as we'd had the challenge of the pandemic and everything was really being introduced at speed. It was really was a rapid process of introduction. And so I reached out, and I don't claim to have written the book. I wrote the introduction, I wrote the afterword, and I edited all of the chapters that were in it and wrote a couple of the chapters as well. But it was an edited collection of our lead providers at the time who were delivering the Early Career Framework to understand their conditions and their practice for our early career teachers at that point of time in history. I also put in a second section of the book, which is why it was opportunities and outcomes as well, talking to academics who'd conducted research around the Early Career Framework pilots that had taken place before the Early Career Framework started, and asked them what they thought the opportunities of the Early Career Framework were and how that would manifest as it progressed. And what's really interesting is if you go back and you read the Early Career Framework book, the introduction, particularly in the afterword that I wrote, some of the things that I predicted would happen as a consequence of the structure that was put in for the Early Career Framework originally did lead to the consultation and the refinements that we have with the current early career teacher entitlement and the coherent offer, as we call it now, for professional development. So kind of long answer, but I think it actually contextualizes where we are now and why I'm so embedded with it. I have been a teacher educator in the past for a long time. I've worked in skits as well as university provision. And I believe that if we support the professional development and learning of our teachers effectively, and particularly professional development and learning that supports their agencies or gives them the conditions for agency so they can make decisions about their practice, then we'll have a really happy and well-engaged workforce.
Thank you for that. And that's what it's all about. I was going to ask you about your previous experience in terms of the classroom as well. So obviously that's what builds that passion, isn't it? When you've been there and seen it and you understand what it means. And you know, you're very much part of it. Obviously the agency part, there's a few threads that go through this book that really interested me, so I was going to ask you about that later, but so thank you for that, Tanya, just to put in that sort of into some context for us. And it's just understanding this. We do love an acronym, don't we, in this profession as well? So it's picking apart all those acronyms. So as well as being interesting, it's also quite informative as you read through and you understand it and how that's evolved. So I just wanted to ask, just coming to you, Holly, with this one. Obviously, when in terms of how the book is set out, there's quite a few references to Charles Dickens. And that was interesting to me because I suddenly thought, well, beyond Oliver Twist and A Christmas Carol, and I thought maybe, I need to go away and read some Charles Dickens. But I thought that was an interesting choice. So I just wondered if I wanted to ask you really what was behind the decision to start linking some chapters of this book to works of Charles Dickens.
Yeah, of course. And just to say, in terms of just following on from Tanya's kind of background there, I think kind of the ideas for the book, I think we were both really passionate about kind of illuminating the voices of those early career teachers, and definitely from being in the classroom and now involved in ITT, I think definitely it's with the case studies, there's really interesting kind of lens to take the book, and like you said, Tony, you can refer to it, and that's what our main idea was. So the Dickens idea was originally Tanya's idea. I definitely learned a lot about Charles Dickens and had to research as well. But we both felt it provided a really powerful kind of metaphorical lens through which we could explore the early career framework. And especially kind of how I looked at it was that Dickens kind of was concerned with systems about inequality, constraints, disillusionment, and that's a stark, really striking contrast to what we're seeing in teacher development at the moment. So that kind of criticality, that exploration of hope, aspiration, control, and disappointment are what we wanted to really get through to the readers, to reflect on whether the ECF nurtures that professional growth that Tanya mentions, that professional identity, that agency, a teacher voice, and what it is to be a good teacher.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Sorry, Tanya.
I was just going to add to that. You know, Holly was very patient with me because we had a few sort of interesting ideas. We wanted this to be a book that would capture interest all the way through. And I had a friend that I kind of said, oh, you know, we're thinking about putting a Dickensian lens on the book. And he said, I hate Dickens. You know, I'm not sure if I don't really. And I asked him to read it before it was published. And he said, actually, I'm not a convert to Dickens, but I actually really liked the way in which you embedded the essence of what Dickens was trying to say about England at that particular period of time and how there were synergies with where we are now. In my head, all I can hear is facts, 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 and more facts, which is what Dickens wrote about education in Victorian England, that, you know, you weren't supposed to ask questions and you weren't supposed to challenge. You were supposed to learn the facts and regurgitate the facts. And I'll be quite provocative here. In the research that we did for the Early Career Teacher Entitlement, Great Expectations, that's why it's got the subheading book, we realised that the government had never been more controlling. This was the Conservative government, not the current Labour government, more controlling of teachers' experiences of education than they had been in the last 10 years. Well, pretty much actually since 2012, since Michael Gove was Secretary of State for Education, and that teachers were having less and less opportunity to control their own experiences in the classroom. And as a consequence of that, they were feeling less engaged with what they were doing and potentially leaving the profession because they felt they had very little control over what their role was. So, you know, by telling them you have to teach in this way to get this outcome, so you learn these facts because this is what we want to happen. And if you want to use Dickens, it doesn't lead to a happy workforce.
Exactly. And it brings us back to the teacher agency thing, but certainly what in terms of Dickens, what images it conjured up in my mind was, you know, Victorian London and poverty and the fact that education could change that, you know, has the power to change the course of somebody's life and for the better, obviously. So it does, it for me, it's a metaphor that kind of works because it might be a sneaky way. Yeah, for me, yeah. And also, I don't know if Tanya, it might have been a ploy just to get people to read a bit of Dickens, but I actually thought maybe I should read some more Dickens and really understand that meaning a bit more. But yeah, I thought that really works well and adds an extra sort of like, you know, an extra part to the book. I don't know. It adds to it. So in terms of the ECF in its original form, it was built, correct me if I'm wrong, to some extent on the 2019 recruitment and retention strategy. And obviously, as you alluded to, Tanya, that recruitment and retention was a problem long before that. And you've already mentioned a couple of things about the governments, and I'm glad that you brought that up. And I was maybe thinking about asking you about that too, in terms of the current government against what we've had previously. But would it be fair to say that the recruitment and retention strategy has generally not been particularly effective? So if I start with you, Holly, with that one, what do you think?
I think and our book shows us that there's mixed success, and like we've already discussed, the ECF it showcases a substantial investment in early career support, the retention and recruitment of teachers, but there are still challenges. And those challenges that we hear quite a lot, accountability pressures, workload, performativity, and I'm going to mention it again, that limited professional autonomy. And hopefully it comes across that the induction program can't support or reform all those alone. And I think what's emerging, and we're coming into this in our conversation, that there's a lot of standardization, insufficiency within it. So there's hence why there's already been a reiteration with the ITT ECF. So mixed success.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, to add into that, it was interesting because I can remember when the recruitment and retention strategy was launched, and I was invited by the DfE to speak at the Southwest launch for it, because a lot of my research actually focuses on coastal and rural place-based challenges for education, and it's much harder to recruit and retain teachers in coastal and rural areas than it is in more urban areas because of the infrastructural challenges that exist there. So housing, we've got housing displacement with second home ownership. You can't rent during the summer. If you do, it's very expensive to get 12 months tenancies. House prices can be very cheap in very poor areas, but very expensive in others. Then you've got public transport issues. So all of these things, and if you've got a spouse, for example, and want to move, I live in Cornwall, you want to move to Cornwall, then actually trying to find a job for your spouse, because it will require a complete home move, is more challenging. So they asked me to come and talk to it, the recruitment and retention challenge, recruitment and retention strategy, because of the challenges that were particular to the Southwest, but experienced nationally as well. And actually, I was really encouraged by the fact that the government were thinking about recruitment and retention as a crisis rather than just a challenge at this point, because we'd recognized that we were losing so many teachers. I mean, 1/3 of teachers by year 3, I might have got a statistic wrong for 2019, but it's about that. We were losing a lot of teachers very quickly. And the cost of training teachers against the cost of continuing to train teachers as they're leaving in the profession isn't a great way to run the economy either. So the government were very invested in finding strategies that would improve retention. And the idea that a government funded professional development opportunity for beginning teachers, so in year 1 initially, and with the ITT ECF as it now is, so the Initial Teacher Training Early Career Framework, and a 2-year induction period and funded training, is a really positive thing, was a really positive thing, because we hadn't had that investment in our early career teachers' development before that. So while what came out the other end as the early career framework, and the advisory boards did their best to create something that could be delivered at speed and at scale. But the trouble with at speed and at scale is it's very standardized in order to be produced by lots of people and try and achieve the same kind of outcomes. When you standardize, you lose context, and schools are all about context. They're contextual places. Every school is different, every child is different, and every early career teacher is different. And they bring different experiences, identities to bear on the role that they're doing. And a very general, standardized framework of development with delivery that is quite standardized and generalized makes it very challenging to support the contextual needs of those within that framework. So the intention was really good, but the initial operationalization of it, which I said was delivered at speed, so the lead providers did the best that they could with the time frame that they had, made the experience quite challenging for many of our early career teachers, which is why Holly and I wanted to do that primary research with them and really listen to how they received the early career framework. What was it like for them? And the mentors that were mentoring them, because this was the first time as well we'd had money from the government to give mentors time out of their teaching timetable to work with their early career teachers. And the recruitment and retention strategy also had other professional development and learning developments within it, such as national professional qualifications. So it was all about creating this golden thread, and Holly's expert on the golden thread, this golden thread of professional development that would run through a teacher's career to support them at all stages, so that we would have effective and informed, evidence-informed teachers who would become our leaders. I don't know if you wanted to add to that, Holly.
Yeah, just reiterating that, and a lot of our research said about the highly prescriptive content. It added to their workload, the delivery. It wasn't subject specific. There was quite a lot that came out about the role of mentors. And actually, we both feel that ECF did put mentoring kind of on a spotlight. And there's a lot more that we can offer mentors and their role as well.
Yeah, and I think that was a question I was going to ask you, but seeing as you mentioned the golden thread, again that is mentioned a few times in the book, and I didn't have a specific question I'd planned to ask you, but I just wondered, for anyone listening, what is the golden thread? I mean, is it something I should have heard of as a teacher?
Hopefully in terms of your development. We see it as a kind of a pathway for teachers through teaching. So as Tanya said, starting out for beginner teachers, early career teachers, and then providing opportunities for professional development throughout each stages of their career, with the aim of retaining the best teacher workforce that we can.
Absolutely.
So really starting with initial teacher training, which is why it's now become the ITT ECF, to connect that initial training before you become a teacher to your beginning teacher phase, so early career teacher, all the way through. But we don't really talk about the golden thread anymore. We talk about a coherent offer, and that coherent offer is the professional development and learning. And I think that, there's a big clue in our thinking, because when we were writing the book, we were doing it with our research heads on. So trying to be as neutral as possible, looking at the evidence and treating the evidence with criticality, which doesn't mean being critical. It means engaging with what's working or what's not working. And the golden thread was in chapter 2, which we called Bleak House. And and the quote from Bleak House we took to kind of give the feeling for the chapter was, the system had enabled him to dash through his tasks. And it really felt like the golden thread was about teachers completing tasks that they said to us felt like tick box exercises. Again and again in all of our interviews, they said, oh, it's like a tick box. And actually, they got quite adept at understanding that sometimes they could just tick the box and not actually do it, because nobody was checking or whether they'd completed their tasks or not to go to the next stage, because the sequencing of the early career framework wasn't necessarily sequenced to what they were doing in the school because of this general and standardized approach. So it's interesting. And you have to remember that all of this kind of developed as university provision for teacher education, and that's in its wider sense, from initial teacher training all the way through to professional development and learning in master's degrees and things like that, were being removed. So the loss of university-based teacher education departments, because the government had decided in 2012 that schools should take on the responsibility for teacher education from initial teacher training all the way through to delivery with lead providers of national professional qualifications. So it's been a really unstable time.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that, actually. It wasn't a question that I had. I think it was one of my supplementary questions, but it did occur to me. I did, many moons ago when I trained the old-fashioned PGCE with the element of being at university, and I felt like I needed that support of the university behind me. And I do wonder how I would have done without that. Do you think we lost something when we moved away from the university-based approach?
Well, we still have a lot of university-based teacher education. It's a very mixed economy. So it's interesting because I've worked in both fields. So as I said, working with skits and working with university-based provision as a head of school in a university. And the value that each of those bring is different. And I think it comes back to the individual need of the trainee teacher. So you can have quite experienced individuals of education. So say a teaching assistant who has spent a lot of time working in a school, who may find that a skit is better for them because the skit allows them to start training very early on, and they don't feel the need for that additional support that a university-based provision might get. But remember that many skits, my skit included at the time, had the praxis, we call that when theory and practice meet together, of having a PGCE. So many skits are working in partnerships with universities to have that postgraduate qualification as well.
So having that flexibility for different...
I think it's...
Yeah.
There was a... Sorry, Holly.
Sorry, no, just jumping on that. I mean, the apprenticeship route is becoming quite a popular option for teacher training now. And I think with the introduction of ITAPs, intensive training and practice, like Tanya was just alluding to there, I think through whatever route you do, it's the ability, and it is dependent on the individual teacher, but being able to apply that theory to practice. Hence why through like you said, in terms of training in a school-based route, you do have that opportunity for a large chunk of your time to start applying that theory to practice. When you mentioned that, Tony, I thought about kind of the academic rigor that these courses and obviously the early career framework wants early career teachers to become more evidence informed, drawing on the most recent research. I think that's really important, and I'm seeing definitely in my role a lot of trainees just offering or going for the QTS route instead of the PGCE element, which we can argue that is potentially a missed opportunity to really delve into kind of the academic side, the research into what you're doing, why you're doing it.
I completely agree, Holly. I mean, the biggest loss I think we've had to teacher education is the expertise that existed within teacher education departments in universities. So the expertise of the teacher educators in supporting that praxis, that understanding of theory. You wouldn't ask a doctor to operate without understanding why they're operating and how to do it, and what would work in a situation if something went wrong. Yet, if we're engaging teachers in practice-only based training without any kind of theoretical underpinning, how do they know what to do if what they're doing doesn't work? So we need to prepare our workforce for the future, so for their futures, so that if they change schools or they change MAT, if they're in a multi-academy trust system rather than local authority, they've got the toolkit to be able to create the best learning environment for any learner. And having a teacher education program that gives them that theoretical background as well as that practical training and skills, I think is crucial. So I think the biggest loss is when programs don't support that. And also the loss of the master's degree, really. We still teach a master's in education, but our numbers have reduced because all of the promotion went into MPQs and they were fully funded by the government until a couple of years ago. There are a couple that remain funded, but school teachers now don't really understand about master's degrees because they haven't really had that as part of what their professional development and learning could be.
Sorry to interrupt.
Mm.
I mean, CPD was something I was moving on to. I will move on to later to ask you, because I was interested in some of the comparisons you made with places like Singapore, for example. So we'll come to that in a bit, because I thought that was quite interesting. But certainly, you know, going back to what you guys were saying about the case studies, another thing that really improves this, guys, if you've just joined us, we're talking about this book today. This show is sponsored by Hachette Learning. And we are talking about early career teacher entitlement, great expectations. If you would like a copy of that book, it's available on Hachette website. So get yourself over to the Hachette website, hachetteLearning.com, and have a look for this latest book. So we've been talking a little bit about things like teacher agency, autonomy, self-efficacy. We've touched upon it. Just thought I'd sort of drill down into it a little bit more, because it's a thread that goes through the book, and this idea that that's maybe been eroded in recent years and decades, perhaps to some extent, in terms of how the government has influenced the profession. So I just wanted to ask you about that. So I'll start with you, Holly, in terms of what specifically is going wrong in terms of teacher agency and autonomy that's really affecting recruitment at the moment.
Well, the concepts you made of agency, autonomy, and self-efficacy, they're foundational to teacher professionalism and retaining teachers. And research is consistently showing that teachers who have good job satisfaction, who have that autonomy, who feel trusted in what they're doing, are more capable and more likely to remain in the profession. And I think when teachers see something in terms of their development as being done to them rather than with them, that self-efficacy, those key concepts are undermined. And it has profound implications we're seeing now in terms of teacher well-being, individual well-being, but also for sustainability of the profession. So really, really important, giving teachers, like we said at the beginning, hence why we wanted to include those case studies, those lived experiences. I mean, one example that comes to my head is the career changer that we had in the book, who had a really high-performing job, worked over 60 hours plus, and moved to teaching during COVID. She wanted more kind of consistency, more control of what she was doing, and she compared her other career as she would go back to it rather than teaching in terms of what she was experiencing with the early career framework. So definitely, like we said before, the prescribed nature, the content that's set out, the delivery methods, they're definitely eroding that sense of for teachers to develop their own teacher identity.
And I would add into that part of why schools are creating this environment for teachers isn't because they want to, but because of the other system factors that are impacting on them, like accountability through Ofsted, for example. So in order to maintain the school's position and how it's seen within their community, the fear of not doing well in terms of inspections for Ofsted, for example, can drive some schools to create these standardized approaches that ensure all teachers are doing it the way that they're, in inverted commas, supposed to be doing it, because that's the way the government said it's better that teaching takes place. It's not all schools, but you know, there are these consequences of the way in which the Secretary of State for Education, who does make all the decisions about what happens in education, or Secretary of State, so I'll put that into plural, have controlled the way education has developed since 2012. This government, I would say, they have been looking at ways to unpick what has been put in place. We've had the curriculum assessment review, for example, and they've been talking about the way in which we can have a fully qualified workforce again, because you do not have to be a qualified teacher to work in an academy, free school or studio school. That was introduced in 2012 under Michael Gove, which has created a whole wealth of unqualified teachers, which again has an impact on teacher status, which links to identity and confidence around what your professionalism actually is.
Again, that really interests me, Tanya, that because quite a famous head teacher, and I won't mention a name at this point, made a comment along the lines of that she couldn't possibly run her school if it wasn't for unqualified teachers. And the fact that you would insist on teachers all having the professional qualification is not the way to go. And I just felt like I fundamentally disagreed with that, because again, some people, again, I saw a comment and I can't remember where this came from, along the lines of whether we should even be considered professionals. So this,
well, I've written on it. I've done research looking at the deprofessionalisation of teacher, and I wrote one quite provocative article called "A Teacher as Commodity or Teacher as Professional," because actually the way in which teachers have been commodified and standardised was really impacting on the way in which teachers perceive themselves, as well as how they're perceived by society, and particularly, you know, it really still pains me that during the pandemic, teachers were seen as skiving off, not doing their jobs, not teaching, when we all knew, who were in the profession, that the schools were still open and that the children of key workers and those most vulnerable were still going into school, but that actually all the children were being taught as well as we could do within the pandemic by utilising technology. Yet the image of teachers were they weren't teaching and schools were closed. So this status that's perceived around teaching has to change. We have to become a graduate profession of choice in order to retain the status of our profession. But to be a graduate profession of choice, we have to be a graduate profession. We have to be a qualified profession. And that doesn't mean that all those unqualified teachers we need to get rid of. We need to support them in becoming fully qualified in an easy way. And the Labour government were quite clear that it would be new teachers to the profession who would be expected to be qualified. I know I had discussions with the government about how that would be operationalised. It's not as easy as it seems because of head teachers like the one you mentioned, needing bodies in front of children. I mean, it's a real conundrum, isn't it? What do? You need somebody in the classroom, and the law says that you can use anybody if you're an academy who you believe is competent to be able to do that. But actually, if you've got somebody like you, Tony, who's done a PGCE, you spent a year of your life qualifying to be a teacher and then done your professional formation over the next few years in school, next to somebody who's come in, they may be a graduate, they may not. I'm hearing more and more stories of those who aren't graduates. And you're getting paid the same and you're both being called teacher. That's deregulating the profession, which our government at the moment is trying to sort out.
It certainly does feel like that. And I think that same person, that same head teacher made a comment along the lines of if someone might want to come in for a few years as a stopgap and then go and do something else. And I really couldn't believe what I was reading at that point, because I very much buy into this is a vocation. You know, I really buy into my job, and I don't think I could do it effectively, you know. So I don't want to, it's not about me, obviously, but my point is a lot of teachers do really feel passionately about what they do. So, yeah.
And where does the professional development sit then? So if you're coming in for a few years, and what Holly and I were writing about towards the end of the book was a call for career-long professional development, not just early career teacher entitlement, but career-long teacher entitlement, because we wanted all teachers to feel, particularly those middle career teachers, that they were being supported in becoming or maintaining their most effective self in the classroom, because confidence is everything. You know, you don't wake up and want to go to work if you feel you're not going to do a good job. So having that continual development of your skills and practice and understanding what evidence is utilised, creating that, I call it with my students, because I predominantly teach master students and doctoral students now, but that toolbox, that kit to be able to do the best job that you can do, understanding the context, the environment, the pupil or student's needs, your needs, the school's needs, the academy's needs, if it's under that. It's a really complex job being a teacher. It's best, I sound a bit trite, but I don't mean to be. It's the best job in the world when you feel confident about what you're doing. I mean, you may smile. It's that lean forward moment when you know that every child in that class is listening to you and they're enjoying and engaging in that. And to get to that stage where you're a teacher with the confidence to do that, you need a toolkit to be able to flex and move what you're doing with the evidence that will work.
Absolutely.
And we want that. We need that longevity in teaching, those teachers that are passionate, not people who are going to enter, teach for a couple of years and then come back. And research shows that our learning and teachers becomes stagnant between years 3 and 5 of teaching. So it's really important, as Tanya just said, encouraging that professional development throughout.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's why all of those things come together. Having that autonomy, that agency is all part of it as well, isn't it? And not having that eroded. That was one of my questions really that I think we've already covered in terms of shifting to a way towards this standardization. You've talked already about the standardization, the accountability, holding to account is a phrase that I don't enjoy hearing, because it tends to have negative connotations. It tends to be linked to outcomes. And again, there's mention of your in the book as well. And I'm going to ask you in a minute about neoliberalism, which is a word that comes up too. But we can ask about that now. Then I can actually get a coherent question out that you can answer. Because neoliberalism comes up a lot, and I just thought that was quite interesting in terms of government influence over the education. When you talk about the financial aspect of procurement for providers of various things. I was interested to ask you both about that, really. So I don't know who wants to start, but just in case anyone's not sure about what neoliberalism is, I wondered if you could sort of give us a definition and then explain why you think it's such an important factor affecting the profession.
It's about how education is seen as a market, and we definitely feel in terms of neoliberalism, how education can be shaped through market mechanisms, through competition, through that centralized control. So, for example, just give you an example, the procurement of ECF providers is one example, and it's where professional learning has become commodified. And going back to teacher agency, it's where these things are put in place to reduce professional trust. And as Tanya talked about scalability, it prioritizes that scalability over that pedagogical richness as such. And overall, we're seeing definitely education ran in terms of a business, but it's increasingly driven by performativity rather than professional judgment. I'll leave
that was brilliant, Holly. That was I mean, we wrote, if anyone's really interested in this area, we've written a couple of other things together as well. So we've written a journal article, and it's open access as well, so anybody can get it off the internet, which really kind of explores that neoliberal policy direction that the government took, particularly from 2010 onwards. And so we've explored that in quite some detail, haven't we, Holly? And the way in which market, performativity, all of those things that make a neoliberal approach to thinking, make education quite challenging to be the individual personalized experience that some of us believe is the best way forward. So yeah, there's a open access paper on that, and there's also a chapter in a book by Tom Perry and Becky Morris where we explore it as well, and link that to some primary research findings. So what Holly and I always try to do is listen to the voices of those who are experiencing it, and then look at how those voices have been impacted by the policy that's created the framework that they're working or learning in at the time. Gives it that validity.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, you know, again, in the book, that some of the really interesting sections are just listening to people, listening to mentors, listening to early career teachers about the challenges. I mean, we've talked. One of my questions was going to be for some balance, really. We haven't talked in the most glowing terms about the early career framework, but when it came in, do you think there's been any improvements in terms of when that came in 2020 or 2019? 2019. So when that framework came in at that time, do you feel like we've been moving in the right direction?
Yeah, I definitely think the early career framework has clear strengths. As Tanya mentioned, the funded time given for teachers and mentors, the structured mentoring approach that is taken, the support and not just immediate support, but the sustained support through the 2 years that it's given to teachers. So definitely, I mean, we always hear about workload time, and a lot of the reiterations, and providers have listened to that and changed their programs. But for me, I definitely think the more subject-specific content that's been created to help teachers with subject knowledge and the mentoring are key highlights from the ECF.
I think the government took on board lots of the criticisms and challenges they were receiving from school leaders about the way the ECF wasn't working. There was also some significant evaluation and research that was taking place alongside that. So there was a consultation. The consultation also called for any evidence that had been collected by that point in time on the early career framework, but it only had 1 year to run. But they did listen, and the ITT, ECF and early career teacher entitlement is the way in which the government's perceived it now, rather than the early career framework itself. So they're thinking about the entitlement of the individual teacher in their early career and the way in which that needs to be more personalised and more contextualised. So it's got better than it was. There are still some challenges within that, but there always is within a scaled programme. But the lead providers have more experience now. They've had more time to work through what they're delivering. There's been a small change in provision as well. I'm not getting reports, I don't know if you are, Holly, of the death by PowerPoint that we used to have in the first few years of the early career framework. I'm hearing now that the experiences of the way in which they're being taught by partners of lead providers is better and more contextual, and they're enjoying the opportunity to talk to each other too. So one of the big benefits of the early career framework and the ITT ECF is this opportunity to meet other early career teachers and to talk to them about their experiences and about how to get better in their practice.
I'm sorry, I'm building on that the opportunity to attend networking events, that day where you can remove yourself from the kind of chaos of school life and concentrate on meeting other ECTs, yourself, developing your subject knowledge, and that definitely came out a lot in the research.
Okay, well, yeah, that's good to hear. That, I mean, to hear that people maybe that the government are listening a little bit, and obviously we don't expect things to be perfect the first time through, but if people are prepared to listen, the fact that they've put that word in entitlement in is a little bit of a shift, I suppose, in emphasis, rather than here's what you've got to do, here's what you're entitled to have. So, just from that point of view, I suppose it's a shift in that. What did I want to ask you about next? There's a couple of things that come up. CPD, because again, I just mentioned you did some comparisons in the book with other parts of the world, particularly Singapore was an interesting one. And the fact, I mean, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but how little CPD we get in the UK compared to other countries was really quite striking, and it made me think. We talked about that golden thread. I don't feel like there's been a thread, and I think you've both mentioned earlier on in the show as well that we don't have that consistency going all the way through our career. We get that help at the beginning. If we choose a bit to go down a certain route, we can have access to CPD, but we don't really get that career-long CPD. So how big an issue do you think that is? Can we learn from other countries and other parts of the world in terms of improving our CPD in the profession in the UK?
I think it's a major issue, especially career-long CPD, and it's one of the reasons I decided to undertake an educational doctorate. But I felt definitely after 13 years in the classroom, my own learning was becoming quite stagnant, and teachers might resonate with this, but I always felt that there was something covered in set. It was maybe looked at once or twice in lessons, and then there was something new the following inset. And we did include a lot of comparisons with those high performing systems, like you said, in terms of Singapore and the UK. Its historical shows that there is an underinvestment in coherent career-long sustained professional development. And I do believe that teaching and teaching expertise develops over time. And without that sustained CPD and those early gains from what the ECF has given us, that's where that stagnation comes into place. And as I said, CPD shouldn't be seen as kind of episodic or remedial, and it's an entitlement. So that word comes up again, an entitlement and an expectation for teachers in their career.
In the book, we cite a piece of research that demonstrated that if all schools used 1% of their budget, it would cover 30 hours of CPD for every teacher, which means that they could choose what CPD they do. So we talk about agency. You can't give agency, but you can create the conditions for agency. So if we had a school system that said, okay, we trust you as teachers to identify, particularly after those first couple of years where you do need some really strong support as you start into the profession. So say by year 3, we said, okay, you've got 30 hours of professional development and learning that you can be supported in, and it can be whatever you need it to be better at your job. I mean, how liberating would that be? That's a condition for agency, isn't it? And engagement. And it's interesting as well what you said, Holly, about effective CPD as well. So I've been lucky enough to be doing some work with the Teacher Development Trust on a voluntary basis. You know, we've been part of an advisory group where we've been looking at a new way of thinking about the way in which teachers teach teachers. So we've called it didagogy. So just to be a little bit provocative, so this idea that when we teach teachers how to teach, it's not like teaching children how to teach, because teachers come with perceptions of what teaching is already. Everybody's been, hopefully, through an education system of some sort. So you have this idea about what learning is. And at different stages of your career as a teacher, your needs differ in the way in which you receive teaching to learn things. But we never really think about that. And so professional development for teachers has been very sort of standardized and actually quite appalling in some cases. The cognitive overload that I've seen happen in the past, where, you know, a group of teachers has been given the death by PowerPoint, you know, here's loads of information, take this away and apply it in a classroom, and we're never going to revisit that again. but we know better now. And there are lots of organisations working in the education sector thinking about professional development and learning. Teacher Development Trust is one of these, but there are others. And working together, understanding how to support the effective teaching of teachers is crucial to that. And we need to spend time and really think about how that links to their entitlement throughout their career for professional learning. If we're really committed to teaching as a profession, that needs to be the foundation for it.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, definitely makes sense. So yeah, you think through. I mean, it tends to me, if I get some really good CPD, it really stands out to me because yeah, it's quite varied in its consistency and how it's delivered. You get the death by PowerPoint. I was quite amused by the part of the book where you talked about the providers death by PowerPoints and the fact that, ironically, if a teacher did that in a lesson, they would be lambasted quite strongly.
Yeah, one of the early career teachers said, God, if I'd have done that in my lesson and Ofsted were watching, I wouldn't have a job. So
Yes.
I can remember them saying it to me. Yeah.
Well, yeah, there's certainly some truth in that. The other thing that I had here that stood out to me was judging the quality of teaching. And it says, yeah, in the book, you talk about the difficulty in judging what good teaching is. And it says, where is it, if I can find it? So what I was interested in what the issues were surrounding that. What is the challenge in actually judging what good teaching is?
I think definitely there's a tendency to kind of evaluate or equate good teaching to those measurable outcomes, such as test results or, as Tanya said, about inspection judgments. And we all know teaching is complex, it's relational, it's value laden, and I think that we found is that policy reduces those observable behaviours and those standardised metrics, and definitely by narrowing practice, you discourage that kind of risk taking. I see that in a lot of early career teachers, that creativity, and you're overlooking kind of aspects of teaching that are harder to qualify, but equally are really important, and that's things like care, responsiveness to learners, inclusion as well.
It's yeah, Holly's absolutely right. I have a real problem with student achievement and student outcomes being a proxy for teacher quality, because there's 1,001 variables impacting on that child's progress. And if you get into secondary school and you have multiple teachers teaching one child over time for different subjects, or different teachers within subjects, how can you hold student achievement against the quality of one teacher's teaching? It's impossible to isolate the impact of one teacher on one child. So, you know,
sorry, what we do.
Sorry.
We'll put a hand up when we want to speak.
Please, sir.
Yeah, I'm just going to say there are, like you say, I was just picking up on what you said. Some of what we do is quite nebulous, isn't it? I'm always amused by when someone goes on social media, and I probably spend a bit more time on social media than I should, but I'm interested in opinions and things, obviously being the host of a radio show. But if someone says relationships, that tends to be like a red rag to a bull. If you talk about a teacher having good relationships, understanding students, being good at that aspect of it, some people don't like that, do they? Because maybe they're worried that isn't measurable. I don't know why people are so anti that, but I feel like there's so many things I do in the course of my day, working in the school that I'm in the particular context I'm in, that at the moment is very challenging. There's an awful lot more that I do in order to build towards a situation where I can improve outcomes for those students.
Yeah,
if you know
I mean, I absolutely get it. I mean, we're fixated on quantitative measures, on data. And actually, when it is relational, as it is in all education situations, that's much more qualitative and much more complex than any one data variable can say. You know, you can make the data measure something robustly, but it doesn't mean that it's measured it accurately or it's valid.
Yeah, and then correlation, causation, everything else. Yeah, you can use data to show whatever you want to show, I think, really is the issue.
And also, what does great teaching mean? The government prior to this one talked about great teaching and great teachers. What is that? What is a great teacher? I mean, there were 6 elements that the EEF put forward to identify great teaching, but actually, I would say they're the foundations of all teaching, you know, from classroom climate, classroom management, teacher beliefs. They're just foundational elements of what we do in teaching practice. So, but how does that correspond to outcomes? There are too many things in between to connect them. It's a poor proxy.
Yeah, too many moving parts. It's been really a pleasure to talk to you two this evening. We have just gone over an hour. And I just wanted to mention one last time that our show this evening is sponsored by Hachette Learning in partnership with Hachette Learning. And this book, which I've enjoyed reading over the last week or so, by Tanya Ovenden Hope and Holly Kirkpatrick. It is available today, guys. So go out and get yourself a copy. It comes highly recommended. It is interesting, informative, entertaining. A few of the parts towards the end actually made me laugh out loud. No spoilers. But yeah, a thoroughly recommended read if you are involved with early career teachers. So that's Early Career Teacher Entitlement, Great Expectations. Go out there and give it a look, guys. So before we sign off, do you think I've missed anything, Holly or Tanya, that you sort of wanted to mention about your book?
Just kind of lasting kind of thoughts from me, and what we kind of the impact of the book. We wanted it to kind of open up that critical conversation about teacher development, and hope that those who are reading it, policymakers, those who are involved in the development of teachers, move away from that compliant approach to give teachers that voice so they can grow and flourish, really.
And I would add to that I've actually been using the findings from our book in our teaching at the university. So I've spoken at our mentor conference, which is with our mentor teachers from schools working with our trainee teachers, about the way in which their role as mentor is so crucial to the outcomes of their trainee teachers' experiences. So are they just following a framework, or are they engaging in authentic professional learning with their trainee teachers? So it's been really useful for us as a university to utilise this and think about how we can take our learning from the book and make it valuable in practice.
Absolutely. Yeah. So hopefully you do have the ear of those policymakers, and they do sit up and pay attention to these issues that are covered in the book. So thank you so much for joining me, Holly and Tanya. It's been really nice to talk to you. But we've gone just over an hour. It's been really good. It's been very informative, just to get your thoughts and to go through some of those things in relation to your book. So that is it from us this evening on Teachers Talk Radio, guys. I just want to say thanks once again to Holly and Tanya for joining me. And I hope everyone has a really nice, restful evening, including the dog. And I'll see you all next time here on The Twilight Show on Teachers Talk Radio. Good evening, everyone.
Outstanding, a world-class vision, a world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.